As I near the end of my time in this place, I recognise more than ever before just how lucky I've been to be nearly 19 years a senator for the Australian Capital Territory. Lucky because I've never had to be at work too far away from my family and friends, and I empathise deeply with my colleagues who find themselves travelling vast distances to be here every sitting week. But also because I'm privileged to live in such a beautiful city, and you only need to look out of the outer corridor windows in this building to see the most beautiful surroundings and taking in that breathtaking view across the lake and towards the mountains. In fact, wherever you look here in Canberra, you can't help but soak in the splendour of what it is to live in the bush capital. Again, I've had many opportunities to interact with those of our community who are passionate about our natural environment, be it flora or fauna, over many years now, and I certainly feel it, live it and breathe it as I continue to choose to live my life here in this beautiful city. For any Canberran who takes the opportunity to explore the hills around this city, they are greeted every time by a unique and special view. From Mount Ainslie, for example, which happens to be my favourite summit, what's laid out before you is the wonder of the Griffins' visionary plan of a century ago. You only need to turn your eyes south to see right there in front of you Marion Marnie Griffin's extraordinary satellite snapshot of what Australia's national capital might become, based on her husband Walter's ideas. Magically formed. These ideas were magically formed, and I say magically because they did it without actually coming to Australia, in a very grey and chilly Chicago suburb in the winter of 1911 and 1912. The Griffins, of course, should not get all the credit for what we see here in 2015 in our national capital. In fact, it was Prime Minister Robert Menzies who made a crucial intervention in our capital city's grand narrative through the 1950s, where he provided the necessary funding and patronage. Decades earlier, John Christian Watson, Labor's first Prime Minister, also made a significant contribution to Canberra. And like so many of the stories of early Canberra, Watson's is nearly lost. It was, of course, reinvigorated through the course of the National Capital Centenary, but I'd like to just reflect on it a little. It was a tricky and contested time when the nation's capital might have been marooned forever in Melbourne or relegated to some other less elegant location in New South Wales. But it was Chris Watson who visited the Monaro region in 1906. He stood, it seems, right on top of Mount Ainslie and allowed himself to dream an identifiably Australian dream, and he spoke about it later. There is a plain in the centre and foothills all around, varying the general appearance of the country. And beyond that, after further rolling foothills, we have on the southwest and south the Murrumbidgee Mountains, towering as a background and proving a most effective foil to the other scenery. In the vicinity there are mountain gorges which afford every diversity of scenery, full of beauty and within a short distance of the suggested capital site. I do not say that picturesqueness alone should decide the question, but other things being equal, I think that the beautiful ought to turn the scale. Mr. Acting Deputy President Watson, like so many to follow him, was in an elevated mood, but so too the Griffins, without even seeing the place. As I mentioned, Walter Burley Griffin had his own dream, a democratic dream for a country that he'd grown to admire for what he called its most democratic tendencies. Griffin wanted to give Australians a capital to suit their egalitarian character. And in his memorable words, which I think I've quoted in this place previously, I'd like to do it again. I have planned a city not like any other city in the world. I have planned it not in a way that I expected any government authorities in the world would accept. I have planned an ideal city, a city that meets my ideal of the city of the future. Well, I think this is the stuff of inspiration, and there's no doubt that many since have found similar sustenance when applying themselves to the Canberra project. Ronaldo Jurgler, one of this city's most treasured citizens, began to design this Parliament House, surely destined to be World Heritage listed in the coming years, He said that he constantly felt the illuminating presence of the griffins on his shoulder as he sketched preliminary plans in his New York office in the late 1970s. It's troubling that many of our representatives and leaders have somehow, and I don't know how, formed a somewhat negative view of this city. There were recent comments about the location of Australia Day celebrations by the Northern Territory Chief Minister, Mr Adam Giles, where he referred to Canberra as a city of just beige buildings. A very naive view of someone who has obviously not spent any time to take in the natural beauty of the nation's capital or appreciate the substance of its plan and surrounds. I also am well known for criticising previous Prime Minister John Howard in refusing to make the capital his home. I believed at the time it showed a great disdain for the status of the national capital. Former Prime Ministers Mr Malcolm Fraser and Mr Paul Keating have also, in a more recent public appearance, expressed a mutual dislike of Canberra, suggesting the capital should have been in Melbourne or Sydney. Now, I love both Melbourne and Sydney, it's true. I was born in Sydney and I've grown to love Melbourne very much. So it's just pitiful that somehow people find it necessary to reflect on the national capital in a negative way, somehow comparing it to two extremely large and very successful state capitals who form integrated parts of our economy and of course, esteemed capitals of their respective states. A like of a city is not to diminish the role or status of the national capital in any way. In fact, in many ways, it underscores the uniqueness and importance of this place. So I would argue that these narrow views not only ignore the genuine beauty of the capital, but an ignorance concerning our national capital's foundation story, in point of fact, a story rich with a set of international connections embracing the best of what humankind was thinking 100 years ago. And many of the people who inspired the then fledgling Labor Party in the Federation era were the very same people who inspired Canberra to be conceived as an ideal capital. Mr Acting Deputy President, I chaired a joint standing committee inquiry into the role of the Australia's national capital in 2008 entitled The Way Forward. And I wrote in that forward, the challenge for all Australians is to ensure that Canberra, as our national capital, continues to be planned with the high ideals first articulated by the Griffins. And in the 7 years that have passed since then, I believe it is fair to say that this challenge has become even more pressing and ever more urgent. We've had 2 more inquiries since then, one chaired by Senator Louise Pratt, entitled Etched in Stone, Inquiry into the Administration of National Memorials Ordinance, and the other overseen by Dr Alan Hawke, entitled Canberra, a Capital Place, report of the independent review of the National Capital Authority. All 3 of these inquiries produced a raft of sensible and well-researched recommendations for Canberra during the 21st century, and yet few of these bipartisan recommendations have been implemented, partly because of the leadership volatility that has engulfed parties in recent years, but also because of the prevalent belief that nothing is worth spending taxpayers' dollars on that isn't cost-neutral or money-making. Well, I think that if you value the role of the national capital in the context of the part that it plays in our Australian story, our collective Australian story, it's important to make the investment in the national capital to ensure that all Australians have the opportunity to feel that they are part of it. Canberra is in essence a public asset. It demands our careful attention. Our national capital is too precious to be marginalised and subject to 100 lazy and ill-informed cuts. It's not good enough to have only the national cultural institutions, along with the National Capital Authority, doing the hard yards developing the cultural fabric of our capital city. They find themselves often friendless, cash-strapped and forgotten. The load must be shared and proudly showcased by the Australian people through the vehicle of the appropriate federal government department and with financial support. There are many things about Canberra that I love, but one of the most important is that it is our national capital, and I'm here on behalf of the people of the ACT, and Canberra is here on behalf of all Australians.
Thank you, Senator Lundy. Senator Lazarus.
Thank you, Mr.